Okay, so you guys requested a deep dive into something pretty personal, and we're going to be looking at the idea that prolonged celibacy could be due to spiritual blockages, and we'll be focusing specifically on the Christian perspective based on the source material you've sent.
Yeah, I think it's important to say right from the start that we're not saying any of this is factual. We're simply exploring the concepts that are presented in the material and really trying to understand the belief system.
So kind of putting on a specific set of lenses to
Exactly.
see how this worldview explains this particular problem. And the language used is pretty wild. I mean, we're talking about things like spiritual spouses,
Yeah.
even night husbands and wives, like these unseen entities that are messing with your relationships.
Or it is playing on a very human fear, right? This
Yeah.
fear of being alone, never finding love. And to think that there's some invisible force that's actively working against you to prevent you from finding a partner, I mean, that just adds like a whole other dimension to that fear.
It really does. And the source actually makes a distinction between what it calls normal celibacy, like maybe you haven't met the right person yet or you're focusing on other things in your life, versus this idea of spiritually caused celibacy. So how does it explain that difference?
Well, it relies a lot on biblical passages.
Hmm.
Verses like Isaiah 53.56, talking about Christ bearing our burdens,
Right.
Hebrews 12.24, referencing the blood of the covenant. The source argues that Jesus' sacrifice basically provides this way to break free from these negative spiritual influences.
Okay.
And what I find interesting is that these passages are usually focused on like bigger spiritual concepts, but here they're being used to specifically explain celibacy.
So it's like Jesus already won the battle, but you have to somehow activate that victory in your own life.
That's the idea being presented, and that's where the whole idea of prayer and spiritual warfare comes in. The source is really emphasizing that you have to engage in these practices if you want to overcome these spiritual blockages.
So to kind of give us a bit more context, how common is this type of interpretation in Christianity as a whole?
Well, while the idea of spiritual warfare and deliverance can be found in various Christian denominations, this specific interpretation is more likely to be found in charismatic or Pentecostal circles.
Okay.
These are the groups that tend to emphasize more the direct experiences with the supernatural, which include things like demonic influences and spiritual battles.
Gotcha. So someone listening to this might be thinking, hold on, could this be why my love life is a mess? How would they even know if they were supposedly under this spiritual celibacy?
Well, the source lists out various signs and symptoms, but they're very, very broad. Things like feeling like you repel people even though you're attractive, or coming from a family with a history of failed marriages, or even no marriages at all, or just unexplained difficulties in relationships.
I mean, those are pretty general experiences that a lot of people could relate to, no matter what they believe.
Exactly. And that raises the question, is this intentional? Is it made to be broad to make the belief more relatable? The more people see themselves in these descriptions, the more likely they are to accept the source's premise.
So it casts a wide net. But for someone who does resonate with these signs, what does the source say the solution is?
Well, it offers this message of hope. It says, you're not a victim. Jesus has already won this battle,
Yeah.
and through him, you can find deliverance. It emphasizes that ancestral curses, or pacts made with these spiritual spouses. And that's something we can unpack a bit further later on. But he says these curses or pacts are broken by accepting Christ
Yeah.
and becoming, as the source puts it, a new creation.
Okay, I'm curious about these ancestral curses.
Yeah.
What exactly is that referring to?
So the idea of ancestral curses
Mm-hmm.
is that negative patterns or consequences can be passed down through generations. They affect the descendants. So basically, even choices made by your ancestors could be affecting your relationships right now.
It's like a spiritual reset button for your love life. But to get back to these spiritual spouses, I mean, what is the idea behind this?
This is a fascinating concept, actually, and it kind of draws on different folklore traditions. The belief is that there are these spiritual entities that can attach themselves to people, and they pose as like a husband or a wife in the spiritual realm. And basically, by doing so, they block you from finding a true partner in the physical world.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And while it's not explicitly said in the source material, this concept often ties into the idea of succubi and incubi, which are these demonic entities that try to seduce and exploit humans.
Sounds like something straight out of a supernatural thriller movie.
Right.
So how does the source say you deal with this spiritual spouse?
Well, it doesn't just present the problem, it actually offers a very specific solution, a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
It includes this really detailed prayer that calls upon the power of Jesus' blood to break these spiritual ties.
So it goes beyond just saying pray about it and actually gives you a specific prayer.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
It's actually quite common in deliverance practices, especially within the charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. Providing a structured prayer can be seen as a sort of ritual. It gives people a sense of empowerment when they're trying to find a solution to these problems. And the specific wording, often invoking the blood of Jesus, is meant to symbolize this act of cleansing and breaking free from these spiritual ties.
It's interesting. The prayer also mentions being clothed in glory. What does that mean?
So that imagery is meant to evoke a sense of spiritual transformation and attractiveness. You're basically, by declaring yourself clothed in glory, you're claiming this new identity in Christ, one that's free from the spiritual spouse. And you're basically radiant. You're radiating this spiritual light that's supposed to help you attract the right partner.
So it's not just about breaking free from the negative, but also actively drawing the positive. It almost sounds like a spiritual version of positive affirmations.
It's a good observation, yeah. The source really stresses how important it is to replace negative beliefs with positive ones and aligning yourself with God's will, which does sound like these affirmations people use to manifest desired outcomes.
Okay. So the prayer itself, what effect does that have on the person praying?
Well, it's intended to create a multifaceted effect on a practical level. It's about taking control and declaring victory over this obstacle. Emotionally, it can bring a sense of hope and empowerment, but perhaps most importantly, it reinforces the belief system itself. Because by engaging in this prayer, the person actively affirms their belief in the reality of spiritual warfare and their need for deliverance.
It's like a self-reinforcing cycle. You believe in the problem, so you engage in the solution, which then strengthens your belief in the problem.
Exactly. And this actually leads us to the next point that the source emphasizes: the need for this ongoing spiritual maintenance. It's not a one-time fix. The idea is that you need to actively resist these negative spiritual influences. And you do that through daily practices like reading the Bible, guarding against sin, and continually reaffirming your identity in Christ.
So you're always on guard, making sure those spiritual blockages don't come back. Doesn't that create a sense of pressure, like constantly being under threat?
That's a good point. If someone is convinced that they are perpetually under spiritual attack, it could lead to a lot of anxiety
Yeah.
and a need to control every little aspect of their life, including their relationships. They might also be more likely to see any relationship challenge as a spiritual attack, rather than just a normal part of human interaction, rather than just seeing it as like a normal part of interacting with people.
Right.
It goes beyond just listing these verses, though. It really provides a detailed analysis of how those verses actually connect to prolonged celibacy. So, for example, the source uses Colossians 2.14:15, which talks about Christ triumphing over these, principalities and powers, to argue that his victory extends to relationships and includes overcoming these spiritual spouses.
Okay, so they're connecting these, broader biblical themes of spiritual victory to this very specific issue.
Exactly, yeah. It's taking these existing theological concepts and applying them in a way that directly addresses this problem of, being celibate for a long time. And this also ties into the source's emphasis on personal responsibility. It's not just enough to pray for deliverance. You also have to actively resist these negative influences through righteous living.
So even if you're praying for God's intervention, you still have to put in the effort yourself?
That seems to be the message, yeah. It suggests that finding a partner isn't just about divine intervention. It's also about aligning yourself with God's will through your actions and choices.
So you're kind of constantly on guard, scanning every interaction, looking for signs of spiritual interference. That sounds exhausting.
It certainly could be. It does make you wonder how this belief system might affect someone's view of relationships in general. Like, if you're convinced that every little setback is a spiritual attack, could it make you more hesitant to open up to people or trust potential partners?
Yeah, like maybe you're afraid to even go on dates because you're worried about attracting the wrong kind of attention from these spiritual spouses, or, you're quick to blame any relationship problem on like a demon instead of addressing maybe some underlying compatibility issues.
Yeah, those are all very valid concerns. I mean, the source's intention is definitely to empower people.
Hmm.
But we have to consider the potential downsides. Constantly looking at relationships through this lens of spiritual warfare could just lead to a lot of fear and distrust, not only in others, but in yourself.
You're always on the defensive, looking for threats, instead of just enjoying the journey.
Exactly. And I think that's where it becomes really important to consider, other perspectives on prolonged celibacy. The source attributes it to these spiritual causes. But there are so many other factors that could be at play. Things like personal patterns, emotional baggage, social anxieties, even just the difficulties of modern dating.
Yeah, so many things that have nothing to do with demonic interference.
Exactly. And while the source's message of deliverance might speak to some people, it's important to remember that there are other ways to deal with these relationship challenges. Things like therapy, self-help resources, learning healthy communication skills. These can be really powerful tools for personal growth and creating fulfilling relationships.
So it's not about saying the source is wrong, but just acknowledging that's one perspective within this larger conversation
Like
about
that.
relationships and the challenges that people face.
Right. And I think it's so important to approach this topic with a lot of sensitivity and respect for everyone's views. Not everyone who struggles with being single for a long time will see it as a spiritual issue. And it's crucial to acknowledge that there are many different experiences out there.
Okay, so we've gone deep into the source's explanation. We even touched on some alternative viewpoints. But for someone who requested this deep dive, what's the key takeaway here?
Well, the takeaway is that the source offers this very specific worldview, but we need to see it within a larger context. There are many paths to understanding and dealing with relationship challenges, and what resonates with one person might not resonate with another. It's really about finding what empowers you and helps you navigate your own journey.
I love that. It's about personal empowerment, not just blindly following a set of beliefs.
Exactly. And I think this whole discussion brings up an important question. How much of our experience is shaped by what we believe? If someone's convinced they're under this spiritual curse, could they be unconsciously sabotaging their relationships or interpreting every little setback as proof that the curse is real?
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yay.
You believe it, so you act in ways that make it come true.
Exactly. And that's where the source's emphasis on daily declarations comes in. The idea is that by constantly saying positive statements about yourself or your future relationships, you can reprogram your mind and attract the right partner.
So it's like a spiritual version of positive affirmations. You manifest your soulmate by speaking it into existence.
Yeah, you could say that. It aligns with the concept of speaking things into existence, which is often found in prosperity gospel teachings. It's the belief that your words have power. And by speaking positive declarations, you're aligning yourself with God's will and attracting blessings into your life.
But doesn't that oversimplify things? Relationships are complicated, right? It's two people making choices, facing challenges, growing together. Attributing everything to a spiritual battle kind of ignores that human element, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a valid point. While the source does acknowledge the importance of personal growth and effort, it frames those efforts within the context of this spiritual warfare. Even practical steps like joining social groups or trying online dating become these spiritual acts of defiance against these forces.
So every action, every choice is loaded with this spiritual significance.
Exactly. And it really makes you think about agency and responsibility. If we blame all our relationship struggles on these external spiritual forces, does that take away from our own responsibility for our choices?
Right, like where does personal accountability fit into all of this? Is it entirely up to God to get rid of your spiritual spouse? Or do you have to do something to create healthy relationships?
It's a really good question. The source seems to suggest that both are necessary. You need to rely on God's power. But you also have to actively participate through prayer, spiritual practices, and making good choices.
So it's like a partnership between you and the divine.
Yeah, you could see it that way. But what about the people who don't buy into all of this? Are they just out of luck?
Does the source even address that?
Not really, no.
Huh?
It's clearly written for an audience that already believes in spiritual warfare. But for those who don't, the takeaway might be this broader message of hope and empowerment, the idea that you're not just a victim of your circumstances, that you have the power to change your situation, even if the way you do it is different.
So even if you don't believe in spiritual spouses and all that, the idea of taking control of your life and going after what you want is still relevant?
Absolutely. And I think that's where the conversation becomes really interesting, because no matter what you believe, we all want connection, love, intimacy. Those are fundamental human needs. And the question then becomes, how do we deal with those desires in a healthy and empowering way without giving in to fear-based beliefs or blaming all our problems on these outside forces?
It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the struggles that people face in their love lives and encouraging them to take responsibility for their choices and actions.
Exactly. And that's where things like therapy, self-help, and learning healthy relationship skills come in. Because sometimes the spiritual battle is actually an internal one. It's our own insecurities, fears, and limiting beliefs that hold us back more than anything else.
Whoa, that's deep. So instead of fighting these night husbands, maybe we need to deal with our inner critic or that negative self-talk that keeps us from putting ourselves out there.
Exactly. And that's a battle worth fighting, no matter what your spiritual beliefs are. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to create fulfilling and loving relationships.
Yeah.
And that often takes internal work just as much as external action.
Okay, so we talked about spiritual spouses, deliverance prayers, positive declarations. I mean, what does all of this mean for the person who asked for this deep dive? What's the big takeaway?
That's a great question. Ultimately, it's up to each person to decide what this information means to them. We explored one perspective on prolonged celibacy, but it's important to remember that there are other things that can affect relationships. Attributing everything to spiritual warfare might be oversimplifying a very complex issue.
So if someone is having trouble in their love life, it's probably best to not jump to conclusions about spiritual curses and look at other possibilities like personal patterns, emotional baggage, maybe even just bad luck.
Absolutely. And, talking to a professional, like a therapist or a counselor, can be super helpful in figuring all of that out. Because sometimes the most powerful form of deliverance comes from understanding ourselves better, confronting our fears, and learning healthy relationship skills.
Well said. And even if someone doesn't believe in the whole spiritual warfare thing, there's still something to take away from this. Don't just wait around for a miracle. Take action, work on yourself, be open to possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah, you have agency in this, right? It's not like you're just a helpless bystander. You have the ability to make choices, to learn new things, to grow as a person, and to create a life that feels really fulfilling, with or without a romantic partner.
Right. It's a good reminder that we don't have to find a partner to be happy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much more to life than just romance. And sometimes focusing on personal growth and fulfillment in other areas can actually make you a more attractive partner in the long run.
That's a really good point. Before we wrap things up, there's one more thing I'm curious about.
Yeah, what's that?
The source is so focused on finding a romantic partner. But what about the people who are perfectly happy being single? Does their belief system play into that? Or is it just a personal choice?
Oh, that is a great question. And it goes beyond the specific material we've been looking at today. But it brings up a really interesting point about how societal expectations and personal desires, and even our spiritual beliefs, all kind of intertwine when it comes to relationships.
Yeah, like is the desire for a romantic relationship something that's innate? Or are we taught that it's essential for happiness? And how does our faith factor into that?
Those are big questions. It makes me think about how different cultures and religions view singleness and marriage, and how that can affect people's choices and their experiences.
It's so interesting to see how these bigger cultural and religious contexts can influence our own beliefs and even shape our life paths.
For sure, it adds another layer to our understanding of all of this.
Yeah. Okay, so to wrap things up, we've really gone deep into this idea of spiritual celibacy from this Christian perspective. We looked at the biblical interpretations, unpacked the prayer and practices that the source recommends. We even considered some alternative viewpoints and talked about those broader societal and cultural influences.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope this deep dive has given you a more nuanced view of this complicated issue.
Definitely. And whether or not you agree with everything the source says, it sparked a lot of interesting thoughts and questions.
Absolutely, and maybe most importantly, it's reminded us that we have the power to choose how we respond to these challenges, how we shape our own stories, and how we create a meaningful and fulfilling life, no matter what our beliefs or our circumstances are.
I love that. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.